Hello, everyone, and welcome to Responsible and Beneficial AI and Inclusive Philanthropy. I am Sarah Clough, Vice President for Philanthropy Insights and Analytics and Senior Consultant and Principal at Marts&Lundy. We are excited to dive into how AI and predictive analytics can transform philanthropy to be more inclusive and equitable. Today, we are joined by Maia McGill, CEO of the Inclusive Philanthropy Institute and consulting partner at Marts&Lundy, and Nathan Chappell, Senior Vice President at Donor Search AI. Our panelists will explore the importance of using a holistic approach to data and share how AI can help identify and address gaps in inclusive philanthropy programs. Maia, let's go ahead and start with your insights on race equity and the importance of multidimensional data.
Wonderful. Hello, everyone. I am so pleased to be with you all today. So there is certainly a lot to unpack as artificial intelligence evolves in the fundraising sector. And this hour really barely scratches the surface. And so this workshop is really an opportunity for us to, introduce some other workshops that are going to be in the works for 2025. So please be sure to stay tuned. As we strive to advance meaningful change in our work, there are ethical considerations related to AI that must not only remain at the forefront of thought, but must also be implemented in our sector. To understand the role of responsible and beneficial AI and inclusive philanthropy, we must first define and understand the definition of inclusive philanthropy, as well as its significance. Inclusive philanthropy is an emerging trend in the advancement field and is really a key practice that critically examines economic and philanthropic disparities and histories among racial, ethnic, and immigrant groups. Inclusive philanthropy seeks system change to support areas of need, with philanthropy serving as the major driver. So in describing this emerging trend in the advancement field, Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors shares the following, and listen closely. Most sources define inclusive philanthropy as a philanthropic practice which seeks individuals from diverse backgrounds as active participants in the planning, design, implementation, and the evaluation of programming. It's the opposite of tokenism, okay? The opposite of tokenism. This approach values different perspectives and experiences and aims to make decisions with the people and communities that will be affected. As AI continues to evolve, we must remember the humanity of diversity and inclusive philanthropy, which includes acknowledging that everyone, regardless of their gender identity, sexual orientation, their race, their ethnicity, cultural identity, nationality, immigration status, disability, or spirituality, have lived experiences and perspectives that are really essential contributions to how we fundraise. We must also acknowledge the historical reality of philanthropy and exclusion and how it drives our data. This is a very significant factor to how we will be implementing AI in our work. So let's talk about the historical reality. The historical reality is that philanthropy has been shaped by the interests and priorities of wealthy, white, predominantly male individuals and institutions. Our current fundraising practices, data gathering, and philanthropic models perpetuates white supremacy, saviorism, and inequity. As so much of my work focuses on implementing anti-racist practices into fundraising efforts and strategies, the use of AI really raises some concerns with me, particularly around race equity and the data the AI systems that are pulling from is often one-dimensional and may not reflect the diversity of lived human experiences, and perspectives. In addition, the data that AI systems are pulling from risk reinforcing and supporting racist tropes and stereotypes, causing more harm to socially, culturally, and economically diverse communities. So let's talk a little bit about the harm of one-dimensional data. One-dimensional data does not consider the complex realities, including the cultural and historical realities of different racial and ethnic groups. There is really an intricate intersection between philanthropy, data, and social justice, and by relying on one-dimensional data, the fundraising sector in particular continues to perpetuate inequities that oftentimes informs our fundraising policies, informs our fundraising strategies, as well as our strategic plans. One-dimensional data is narrow and can limit the equitable effectiveness of AI systems. So let me share an example with you all of limitations of one-dimensional data in AI. So let's say that your institution is collaborating with your county's public school system with the focus on increasing the pipeline of high school students to your institution. Your institution is leaning on an AI system designed to predict student success outcomes that focus on standardized test scores, okay? It is highly probable that the data that is presented is one-dimensional, as the predictive outcomes do not consider access to resources and institutionalized racism. So let me break it down even further for you. What we know is that standard aptitude tests have roots in the eugenics movement. Eugenics was founded on the belief that it is possible to distinguish between superior and inferior races, and that historically oppressed racial groups are inherently less intelligent than their white counterparts. Eugenics also served as a foundational pillar for the production of intelligent tests, which were utilized to sort racial groups, rank their intelligence, and exclude people of color from full participation in society and also in education. Standardized tests have long been used to justify the perpetuation of racism and perpetuate false notions of hierarchy and mask existing systemic inequities in educational opportunity. They are mainly a proxy for socioeconomic status rather than a unique measure of academic ability, okay? So when we talk about the AI systems and the data that's being pulled, we have to understand the humanity of the work that we're doing and also understand the historical ramifications that come with that. On the other hand, multidimensional data includes a broad range of variables and perspectives, enabling AI to deliver more accurate insights and requires a holistic approach to gathering and also interpreting the data. One holistic approach to garnering multidimensional data is done through asset mapping. So what is asset mapping? So glad that you asked. Asset mapping provides information about the strengths and the resources of a community and can help uncover solutions. Once community strengths and resources are inventoried and depicted in a map, you can more easily think about how to build on those assets. So there are 4 steps to asset mapping. The first step is setup and planning. This involves identifying strategy and need, identifying and inviting internal and external partners and collaborators who should be involved in reviewing and providing feedback to the strategy and need, and then creating and implementing a plan. The second step is data collection, and this step involves reflective collaboration across the enterprise, which should include multidimensional data as well as key metrics. The third step to asset mapping is identifying assets. And so this includes funding needs, access to community partners and resources, and working with external and internal partners to leverage their resources and expertise. And then the fourth step, mapping and reporting, involves creating a visual aid that highlights current data points and examples of fundraising opportunities and or action items. So really what asset mapping does, it allows you to go from uncovering solutions to sustainable impact using philanthropy as a major driver to achieve systems change. So at this time, I am yielding the Zoom floor to Nathan Chappelle, who will discuss how to leverage AI to address gaps and will also share actionable solutions. I believe Sarah may want to do an introduction though. Yes.
No, so thank you, Maya. I'll have some questions for you in a moment on some of the topics you just covered, but let's go ahead and turn to Nathan to talk about how to leverage AI to address some of the gaps that you just mentioned.
Yeah, I love that. And I love the fact that we're here today talking about the social implications of AI. We're not here talking about, oh, you should use AI or this is the best way to adopt AI. We're essentially hitting pause and to say, look, things that we're doing in AI have real life implications and sometimes unintended consequences that we need to address. And this is an area that I became concerned about when in my first foray into AI back in 2017, where I understood that we were essentially trying a new process and a new method, and that there was quite a bit of possibility to increase bias and to have machines essentially, make decisions based on biased data, but also to flip the coin over to look at how AI can actually help solve for bias. So if we want to go to the next slide, um, I will say that one of the biggest barriers that I come across with people that don't use AI, they're one of three things typically. That it's not private, so my data is going to go out there, and I don't have control over it. It's also not secure, so in the same thing like privacy and security. But the third, and probably equally weighted, is around bias and ethics. Is that I've heard the stories how AI essentially is going to make decisions that are essentially based on biased data in that one-dimensional data that Maya was talking about. One of the things that we started with in 2017 when we started using machine learning to understand the correlation of people who give versus people who do not give, we learned a lot. And there's this quote that from Aristotle, essentially from 2,300 years ago, that talks about it doesn't matter who you ask for if essentially if it doesn't matter how much you ask or when you ask for what purpose or how you ask if it's not the right person to begin with. And, when we started on this process, and I spent 20 years in fundraising, for many of those 20 years, we worked in extremely biased practices where we essentially categorize good versus bad donors based on their wealth. And to Maya's point, that data is largely biased toward, essentially skewed very highly toward rich white males. And I, intuitively knew this for a long time, but didn't have another path to like understand this. So not surprising when we started, in fact, our very first data science project was to take all of the donations over a 10-year period and all the people who said no over a 10-year period. And we used machine learning to essentially quantify the differences between those. Not surprisingly, maybe surprisingly at the time, not surprising now, is that wealth had very little to do with whether or not someone was generous. And so we know this because less than half of Americans make gifts to charities, no matter how wealthy they are. Yet when we polled, and we still continue to poll nonprofit organizations, about 80% of nonprofit organizations use wealth data as their primary measure of whether someone goes into a portfolio. So still today, even though we know that wealth has very little to do with the decision to give, It's the primary way that essentially organizations are finding prospects and prioritizing prospects. So one of the most freeing things that AI has taught us is that, the mathematics, the math behind what makes a donor and a non-donor has very little to do with wealth, but to Maya's point, uses a lot more to do with multidimensional data. How well does someone know you? Are they leaning in? Are they engaging with you? Are they attending an event? Are they filling out a survey? Those data points, the multiple dimensional data, is really what speaks to the connection between you and a recipient or a stakeholder. We go to the next slide. The area that I become really bullish about is this idea that we live in an era today where we can actually reduce bias in our models by, and I'll share a guide on this in just a second, but by understanding the true motivations of generosity, and we can actually remove bias and not amplify that bias, but that takes a conscious effort. But we can also now take predictive AI and match it with generative AI to actually activate those predictions. And so this is an era that we're calling predictive or precision philanthropy. It's this idea that there are no longer personas of groups of people that give to you or don't give to you. I don't need to generally categorize people anymore to say, this is the up and comers and this is the late bloomers and this is the whatever. You do that. Historically, we've used personas to essentially categorize people into groups, and in some ways, helps organizations craft messaging. But precision philanthropy says, look, the data science exists today that we can know every individual by removing things like, say, wealth data and implicit bias. So like age and race and things like that. We can remove that type of data and look at their connection. And we can come up with really accurate predictions on this person essentially is raising their hand because they want to know more about you. And this person is pulling back because maybe this is not the right fit for them. And it gives your organization the opportunity to actually activate a person that's raising their hand or intervene maybe with someone who's not based on any of their biased data, but based on their connection to your organization. And every nonprofit out there has data that speaks to their connection. And if you don't have enough of it, you need to create more of it. Ask ask if you don't know where your people are at and they like you or don't like you, ask them. Do lots of surveys and then report on those surveys to say, like, this is what we're hearing and this is where you're at. So precision philanthropy is this idea that we could take those predictions with a much never no bias, but like a much reduced amount of bias. And then we can identify those giving patterns. And then generative AI, which I'm guessing most people know about, unless you're living under a rock over the last 18 months, something that you're probably using, before you have breakfast in the morning, for the most part, can actually take those predictions and activate them in a way that's personalized through generative AI. So if we go to the next slide, when we're talking about the return on investment, though, of AI, we're not talking about just raising more money. We're talking about using a technology that essentially fosters connection and allows a workforce within a nonprofit to work faster, better, and end up being happier. And this has been something that's been proven through pretty much every test of AI in the last 2 years, which is essentially use two control groups. One uses AI and one does not use AI to perform a specific task. And not surprising, the group that uses AI has greater precision and personalization. They also have creativity boosts in their work, but they do their work faster with a higher degree of accuracy, and they end up having less burnout. So there's this tension, right? Because, you've got the barriers to adopting, but you also know that you have a limited workforce. You don't have unlimited number of fundraisers, unlimited number of prospect researchers, unlimited number of donor relations people, that you need to find ways to work better, faster, and encourage a happier workforce. But you need to do it in a way that is true to the essence of why people give or not give. You need to do this true to the essence of, what makes someone really lean into your organization. And that's by understanding that data and being very conscious of bias in your data. And again, I just share, like, I love that this session is focused more on how to do this well than not just how to do this, because we're faced with things in our sector right now that are questions like, just because we can do something doesn't mean we should. And we're also kind of forced to ask the question, do we trade humanity over utility, because the utility of these tools are pretty profound. Do we have to trade humanity, or can we in fact say we are always going to choose humanity over utility? And sometimes that seems counterproductive because maybe it's a little less efficient, but I echo what Maya is saying, is that humanity has to be ingrained and prioritized in everything we do. And because the technology is going to allow us to do things better, faster, and happier, the draw will be to do those things at scale and not look back. But I would really encourage people to say, before you make decisions to deploy any type of new technology and automation, that you're always ensuring that it prioritizes humanity over utility. So if we go to the next slide, it's really only 2 more slides, and then I know we're going to have some Q&A conversation and hear from what's on people's mind. An area that I've become really concerned with back actually since my first experience in AI was this area around AI ethics. And we think about this as being essentially at this point a minimum expectation. The minimum expectation is to say, look, things can be, you can generate short-term outcomes by using AI, but have unintended consequences, long-term unintended consequences. And we think about things like social media, and social media was probably one of those things that we were confronted with in the very beginning, which was, this, and what by all intention was designed to be something that brought people together. Social media, by intention in the very beginning, was to be the community builder of all community builders, that I could get to know people and diverse groups and populations from anywhere in the world and share our likes and dislikes of dogs or Diet Coke or whatever it might be, and anything in between, and that we would kind of essentially find our tribe. And while that lived for a very short period of time, we recognize that social media, while not unethical, has had significant unintended consequences, like increases in anxiety, increases in depression, decreases in happiness, increases in teen suicide, and the list goes on and on and on. I would argue that we have the benefit today, as practitioners today, to look at those adverse impacts and the unintended consequences of social media to say, how is AI going to play itself out? And if we look at the private sector and the arms race to deploy AI at scale, we know that organizations like Amazon and Microsoft and Google and OpenAI all have responsible AI doctrine that they follow, which is based on an ethical premise, right? None of them are intending to be unethical. But by nature, those organizations don't have to wrestle with the long-term consequences because the stock market evaluates them on short-term gains. And right now, when we look at AI safety, and every one of those organizations has teams that focus on ethics and responsible AI, that there's about 1,000 to 1 differential in the amount of money spent on AI safety versus scale. So literally 1,000 to 1. So for every dollar spent on safety, $1,000 is spent on scale. Not surprising, because those organizations are essentially competing with each other in this arms race. But that's where our sector has to stand up and out and above and hold ourselves to a higher level of accountability, and not just look at things that are important in the short term. And that would, I'd say, ethical AI is a minimum expectation. But we also have to wrestle with, what is this technology going to do in building connection over the long term? And if a simple example of this is, I decided to say, look, we don't need human fundraisers anymore because I can create a bot. I can clone myself with a bot literally by the end of the day today using really off-the-shelf software. I can clone my voice, and I can have my clone ask people for money all day long. And, while technically, from a technological perspective, that is completely accessible, is it beneficial to the long term for philanthropy as a whole? And maybe it is beneficial to some types of organizations, but to many other organizations, that's not. I'm bringing up this question because I think the rubric for success in the nonprofit sector looks very different than the rubric of success for a private sector organization that is focused on scale at any cost. And so again, we're at a stage now that we have to hold ourselves to a higher level of accountability. And so how do we do that? The next slide really guides us through not a comprehensive list, but a type of list. And I'm so grateful for all the people that are on this call and those who will listen to this, to understand that responsible AI is everyone's responsibility. The same way that if I buy a Volvo, I will not be safe in that Volvo if I drive it recklessly. Just because it has a safe track record, I might buy AI from an organization that has a safety track record that seems to be, good, that it is still up to me to ensure that I'm using that software in an appropriate way. So as individuals that live in the philanthropic sector, which I believe has to safeguard trust above all and only use data and technology that fosters trust. And if you essentially are confronted with technology that does not foster trust, you probably shouldn't use it. It's about as simple as that. If it's used to build a relationship between you and an organization in a very healthy, authentic way, then then evaluate it. And if it does not, and it just makes giving transactional, you probably shouldn't use this. So the things that you need to know and you should do, and I think you have to take the responsibility personally, is one, leverage principles that go beyond just responsible AI. There's 1,000 examples of for-profit entities that have responsible AI statements on their websites. That is not enough for our sector. You need to go one step ahead and you need to look at not just short-term outcomes, but long-term consequences to really ensure a more generous future for all. It also means, and right now, less than 5% of nonprofit organizations have an AI governance policy. You probably have a data governance policy. I hope you do, because it talks about the things that Maya is talking about, like what type of data is appropriate for use in our organization versus what type of data do we not track because it's not appropriate for the long-term success of not just our organization, but our sector as a whole. But to go beyond data governance and ensure that every person in your organization is a data steward, to really adopt an AI governance policy that prioritizes humanity over utility. The good news is that we have one that's open source available. It's not the definitive one by any stretch, but we have a collection of around 10,000 people from 100 countries that have contributed to a framework, that are fundraisers that have contributed to a framework for responsible and beneficial AI. And that lives at fundraising.ai, completely grassroots and completely open source. No one gets compensated for it. And all you have to do is take what you want out of it and modify it, align it with the values of your organization. In fact, use AI to do that. Tell it about your organization, copy the tenets of responsible and beneficial AI from Fundraising AI, and have it create an AI governance policy for your organization. It will take you an hour to do that. There's really no excuse not to. We also have to create processes that measure short-term gains, but also evaluate long-term implications. See, when we talk about, again, the ROI of AI, a lot of organizations are, I'm going to use this tool and see how it helps me in the short term. That is not sufficient for our sector. We have to do that in addition to continuously monitor as an organization. How is this going? Are there new unintended consequences that we didn't anticipate? And I hear far too few conversations in nonprofits that say, before we deploy AI, we're going to hit timeout and we're going to talk about what are all the things that could go wrong. It's a really healthy conversation to have. And that's the minimum basis of where you should start from. Say, what are all the things that go wrong? And maybe we try this technology, but we continue to monitor against those things that we think might happen. And also have honest conversation about what are some of the things that we didn't anticipate, and continue to monitor in this continual feedback loop, because AI is a continual feedback loop. It also means, because it's a continual feedback loop, it's a feedback loop of anyone who touches data in your organization. Anyone, a gift processor, a donor relations person, a fundraiser, a prospect researcher, are all now part of the feedback loop. That if your AI is making decisions based on your data, every person who touches data is part of that feedback loop, and it continues to evolve over time. So that means that this is not something that's static. You don't have, in some ways, you have a data governance policy that can pass the test of time as long as you don't introduce new data. But an AI governance plan is a continual adaptation, because it's never the same. So your organization has to get into a routine of this continual evolution of assessing AI ongoing for now and forever from now. It will never end. And that's a very big difference, when we're talking about change management. And if we got a new CRM, we get over the change management of now it's blue and it used to be green, and I put my data in this way instead of that way. That happens one time, and I figured out where somebody moved my cheese. But from a change management perspective in AI, it's a continual feedback loop. It will never end, and you just got to get better at flexing your adaptive muscles. And the last part, and it probably is the most important part, is that we call this, keeping humans in the loop. That at no time AI should ever be just completely autonomous, making decisions for your organization without human involvement. There's a type of AI called unsupervised learning, and unsupervised learning essentially means it's unsupervised. You should not work with an organization that uses unsupervised learning, because essentially you have no control over the decisions that it's making. But interjecting humans in the loop to evaluate continuously under what's called supervised learning is that a human is involved to say, okay, this is what we thought would happen, and this is what happened. What were the things that we predicted? What are the things that we didn't predict? How do we course correct and make adjustments continuously along the way? And so that's basically the essence of every type of AI, even generative AI, which is like, I'm going to craft a letter. Do we just copy and paste a letter and just send out a lot more letters to donors without having a human in the loop to, at the very least, review it to make sure that it reflects the values of your organization? I hope not. And really, the encouragement is that we keep humans at the loop in all stages of AI, whether it's predictive AI or generative AI, that you have stop gaps and people that their job is intentional to ensure that there are safety gaps and checks along the way as AI continues to progress. I'll end with this sentiment that I caution organizations all day long on the appropriate use of AI, but I'm extremely bullish in that AI can be a tremendous amplifier for good in our sector. In fact, I believe it's the only true scalable solution to helping reverse negative declines in charitable giving. And so therefore we need to use it, but we have to burden ourselves with a higher degree and role and responsibility of using this AI, not just in the short term, but the long term as well.
Thank you, Nathan. I think Nathan, we could go down a lot of avenues right now. I have a few questions for you, and I'll encourage any attendees to, we've got a couple of questions submitted so far, which we'll address here in just a moment, but feel free to submit more. But now we'd like to dive into some of the approaches to data gathering and analysis to take this to a little bit more of the tactical aspect of the concepts that we've been talking about in sustainable ways and responsible ways. So Mai, I'll start with you here first. You've really emphasized the importance of that holistic approach to data collection. I'm wondering, can you share a specific example of how an organization successfully integrated multiple perspectives into their data analysis, and what were the outcomes of that?
Great question. So yes, during our anti-racist journey and fundraising micro-credential in May, I introduced our racial equity and fundraising and philanthropy scorecard. And this scorecard is designed to assist organizations in facilitating conversations about equity gaps and disparities, during which organizations provide recommendations and fundraising opportunities to address these equity gaps and disparities that were represented in the racial equity scorecard. One organization that really stood out to me, everyone did a great job, but EVA's initiatives for homeless youth, they're located in Toronto, Canada. They were a great example of integrating multiple perspectives into their data analysis. And their scorecard identified the need to eliminate racism in employment outcomes for Black staff specifically. So what the data did was it identified, it highlighted the challenges such as pay disparities and the toll of burnout and racism faced by their Black staff. The data also included evidence of condition, demographic data that provided evidence of discrimination and racism being embedded into systems across Canada that have unfairly disadvantaged Black women working with homelessness services, data that highlighted the challenges and pay disparities and toll burnout and racism. There was also staff, which we know is so important, staff feedback. as well as feedback from the community that they serve. And this really resulted in holistic, multidimensional data, and it showed the humanity of DEI. And this holistic data then led them to develop a financial blueprint, first by identifying funding gaps based on the data, and then identifying fundraising opportunities and citing recommendations based on those opportunities. And at the end of this workshop, everyone, you will receive a guide that includes this case study and additional data points to consider in your work, and we'll be sure to get that out to you at the end of the workshop.
Yes, absolutely. And I love that, like you said, that human aspect. I mean, when we're talking about multidimensional data, whether it's in the micro-credential or other conversations, one of the things is sometimes you have to talk to the humans to get that other data that you're missing right now. And yes, it means more time, but it's worth it, right? I mean, to make sure that you are collecting more ethical and comprehensive data overall. So I think that's a great example to share. Nathan, I'll now turn to you. So considering the many limitations that you've mentioned, how can organizations balance the use of AI with ethical, responsible, beneficial considerations to ensure that scalability without compromising the integrity of their organizations?
Yeah, another great question, Sarah. I'm fairly bullish on this. Having the benefit, I think, of being older in my career, where I'm less concerned about appeasing other people and doing the right thing, even if it costs more or takes longer. I think, and actually this has been a little bit of a journey, but when I started working in machine learning, and this is the predictive AI side, so essentially taking all the data that we had to predict who would likely become a donor, or who would likely become a sustainer, or how much someone would likely give. We started with this idea that, we'd build this algorithm and it would essentially be a black box. And then that black box would just, make these calculations, and no one would, care how it was made. And that's how 90% of AI works. Like, it's a black box. In the private sector, it's very common. You get a patent on this AI, nobody gets to know how it actually makes its predictions. And I realized somewhere along the way, probably 4 years ago, that had really, really bad implications to our sector. That, the idea that how our sector had to stand out and look different was that we had to focus on what we consider transparent AI that becomes fully explainable to the end user. And so that means, while this it's an added effort to do this, it means that every time AI is making a decision based on, this is the likelihood that this person will make a gift, or this is how much someone might give, or whatever, that the math behind that should be fully exposed. And it's a big shift from how the private sector operates. But it's how at Donor Search, I mean, we built our entire AI practice around transparency and explainability. And it also means that we share accountability with our clients. And so we have stopgaps that keep human in the loop as we're building models and retraining models, that we stop before we deploy it and we say, let's review what the model is doing together and ensure that we're all comfortable. You as an organization and us with our best practices are able to look at where potential biases might show up. The fortunate thing is that there are many bias detectors now in predictive AI that will actually flag any data point to say, this data point looks biased. And it might be biased because it actually has implicit bias and we missed it somehow. It could be race or age or things like that. So we remove all implicit bias. It's a flag. But data can be biased if it's what is called overfitting. So it's actually too represented in a model because it's showing up multiple times. It's another type of bias. And so by taking this time out and saying, okay, humans in the loop, we all get on a call and we review transparently the math behind what a model is doing. And it's not scary math. This is literally like a rank order that every data point has value. And depending on how valuable that data point is, it surfaces, higher or lower on a scale. It's very easy for humans to look at it and be like, well, why does that data point show up so high? Like, there's something wrong here that's essentially overfitting. And so all this means is that our sector has to say, look, we're creating intentional stopgaps and checkpoints where continuously, this is not just a one-time thing when you build a model, but continuously, like in our case, every quarter, to say, okay, this is how a model's performing. This is what it's doing. This is what it's learning. Does this seem reasonable? Is it in alignment with your values as an organization and your values around data integrity? And so all that to say, it's just going back to like this continual feedback loop that you're never ready for, but you're also never done with. Um, and that also means that you have to find a vendor that's as committed to ensuring transparency and explainability in your data that as you are with your data. And that won't be the case for every organization. So I think it's on you to essentially evaluate vendors that are willing to, basically expose their models to you fully.
Well, and again, it emphasizes that iterative process and how important it is to making sure that our work is ethical across all the work that we're doing.
Yeah.
My reflecting on the diverse populations that we aim to serve across the nonprofit sector, and often one of the things we're trying to do as a nonprofit sector is bring different groups together. What innovative data strategies have you seen that effectively bridge that gap across different communities?
So I am located in Miami, Florida, on sovereign native land. There is also a large Bahamian community here. Without the Bahamians, Miami would not have been incorporated. There is a significant history of redlining here in Miami, and redlining is really economic-based segregation, and the list goes on. So because my work encompasses working with these different communities to address how we change policy, data sovereignty is of the utmost importance. So data sovereignty, really what it does, it basically, it respects cultural practices, and it also ensures that data is used to benefit the community, not take away from, which historically, we're really good at that, right? We are really good at taking away from the community, but ensuring with data sovereignty that the community benefits from the data that we're working with them in collaboration on. Another data strategy is really cross collaboration, and this includes collaboration across various sectors. I have also been doing a deep dive into predictive analytics for equity. I don't quite understand it, and I'm glad that Nathan brought it up. Really anticipating disparities to drive equitable interventions is something that intrigues me. And I'm currently looking into learning more about it and its integration into our work at the Inclusive Philanthropy Institute. So again, data sovereignty is something that I mentioned, and then cross collaboration are really those areas that are ways to really effectively bridge gaps across different communities.
Wonderful. Nathan, one of the things that we often hear just around the hesitancy around AI and its adoption is just not even knowing where to start. I'm wondering if you had to say, and I know this will be hard, but the top 3 action steps that nonprofits should take in order to integrate AI into their programs responsibly and sustainably, what would those 3 things be?
Yeah, I'd say number one is to start small. I think the worst thing you could do is say, I've got FOMO, I need to use AI, or my boss says I need to use AI, but I don't really fully understand what it is. AI has become a very difficult term. It's become a term that means everything and nothing. And most applications, that you interface with, if you're using Grammarly or Canva or things like that, Apple Maps and Netflix and Amazon, like you're using AI every day. But the same way, like if you have a toolbox, you don't use a hammer to cut a piece of wood and you don't use a saw to hammer a nail. You use the right tool for the right application. So I think it's more important to understand what is one of the biggest gaps within your organization. What is a pain point within your organization? Is to start small. I'm always reminded of that movie, What About Bob? With Richard Dreyfuss and Bill Murray, where they're like, baby steps. I think was the name of the book, Baby Steps. And because it can feel very overwhelming. And I think organizations that go too deep too quickly end up failing faster because they don't have clarity. So I would say identify the opportunity and find the tool that matches that opportunity. I also would say for number two is it's okay to be overwhelmed and to ask questions. I think it's encouraging. If you're not asking questions like, is this safe? Is it secure? Is it ethical? Is it, going to replace jobs? Is it, what are the unintended consequences? I think you do a real disservice to your organization, to you personally and to your organization. So be curious. I think curiosity is the last true human element that will never be replaced by AI. So like be curious. And then I think the last part is to be adaptable. This is a new muscle. And for some people who like change, I happen to like change. I get bored very quickly. It's why I'm an early adopter. But for those that don't like change, I think we are confronted with as humans unprecedented change right now. It's not something that either you are or are not good at change. It is something that you can work on and to get better at. I believe curiosity is actually the path to doing that. So I would really encourage people, so find the gap, start small, and then to be curious, and then just continue to find new things, just to be curious, to try something new, always, keeping humans front and center. Those are all very human things, right? I mean, those are not anything to do with data or models. I think it just has to do with us as humans and our ability to, acclimate in a time, but do it in a way, of course, and everything we're talking about, do it in a way that is continuously evaluating short term versus long term.
Thank you. That's really great advice. And I love that it's not deeply embedded in the data aspect. It's really contextualizing all the things that need to surround it. Well, now we're going to go a little bit over just because I want to answer some of the questions that have come in from the audience. The first question is directed to you, Maia. An example of asset mapping, and I know you could go on forever here, so we're gonna, she has an entire course on this, folks, that I encourage you to look into, but just to share an example of exactly what you're talking about. When you talk about asset mapping, this individual is curious, are you talking about assets in particular to an individual, a community of people? Just a little bit more context around that topic.
Sure, and you all can see my screen, right?
Yes.
Okay, so I really contextualize and help to break down the asset mapping, those examples that I went through earlier, and really made it a little bit more palatable and usable, right, in our work. And so if you see here, part of your asset mapping, you're really focusing on target populations. So target populations are defined as a demographic that your organization has identified as a priority based on data demonstrating such things as increased need, lack of historical representation, or other metrics highlighting inequity, okay? So that goes to what we talked about earlier, those 4 different areas of asset mapping. So your data, using your data, you're going to identify the target population that you want to focus on, okay? And again, the target population is a demographic that your organization has identified as a priority based on data demonstrating need, okay? So then what you do is you use your data points to serve as evidence of need and or the inequity impacting a target population. The data that you collect will be used to illustrate your campaign's purpose, set fundraising goals, and serve as a benchmark for tracking year-over-year progress. So let's say, for the sake of this example, we've identified one of our target populations as being Black men, right? Because through our data, what we recognize is that they are certainly coming to our institution, but they're not graduating from our institution. So you have the recruitment of and the retention of, and the retention part is what we understand from the data is what is lacking, okay? So then what you need to do then is identify what your strategic pillars are. And these strategic pillars stay throughout your asset mapping process. And strategic pillars are what your organization really will define as the key areas of need and or guiding principles that will shape your overall campaign. Once determined, you will apply your strategic pillars to each target population. So again, this goes back to the cross collaboration. So if you know that your target population is Black males, you know that there's a retention issue. Who do you now need to have at the table? You need to have the Office of Scholarships at the table, right? You need to have academic advisors at the table, and the list goes on, that cross collaboration. So through that, you identify what your strategic pillars are. It also involves having some focus groups with that population, because what we do oftentimes as institutions is we think we understand what the issue is, but we haven't talked to the communities that are being most affected. So what happens is we have a focus group with our Black male students, and what they say is, yeah, scholarship is an issue to why I'm not staying, but we also don't have enough mentors, people that look like me, that can help me through the process of college and what it is that I go through. So a strategic pillar, number one strategic pillar could be scholarships. A second strategic pillar could be mentorship, right? And so then you take a look at what your fundraising opportunities are. You will use your target population, your strategic pillars, and data points to identify fundraising opportunities. So strategic pillar number one is scholarships for Black males, funding opportunities. How do we develop a pipeline of donors, high network donors of color? So you bring in prospect management, right? You have conversation with your alumni. You take a look at affinity groups, right? You may have to do a little bit of a reworking, because to Nathan's point, a lot of times when we do prospect research, we stick to the current ways of identifying donors, and we're not thinking outside of the box, right? And this is kind of where AI can also come in. So this is just a very quick example, and I hope that helps, of what asset mapping really means and how it can then help to help you create a transformation map, which can then help you identify your fundraising priorities. I hope that was helpful.
Thank you. We're going to answer one more here. So there's a question around when we talk about multi-dimensional data, what are some of those data points that we might collect? And this question is about higher education specifically, and how do we collect that? What are some of those data points? I'm going to start here, and then Maya and Nathan, please jump in with anything you might add. So one way that we've helped clients address this is surveying. I mean, as Nathan mentioned, do surveys, do them often, because lived experiences continue to change. So we want to make sure we're not reflecting on data that's really outdated either, especially as from intake or admissions or things like that. So, surveying data around, if you're really finding you lack the demographic data in your database to even be able to segment or identify where there are some biases in your data, those are questions that you can ask in a survey. You want to provide context around why you're asking for that you're really trying to elevate programming, making sure that you're talking to all audiences, and things like that. But in combination with those surveys and collecting some of that data, another thing is focus groups. I mean, one of the things we've talked about is the fact that getting in front of humans, it takes more time, but have those conversations, because that's where you get around the nuances of what are those barriers to participating in a service, benefiting from a program. You don't know that unless you ask, and you can get some of that in a survey. You get a lot more color around those answers when you ask it in a real human situation. Maya, Nathan, things that you would add there?
Go ahead, Maya.
No, the focus groups are always very much a priority, and it goes back to, what I've reiterated, is that it's so important that you have the voices of those who are being affected at the table in order to really garner an understanding. Those lived perspectives, lived experiences are so important. And unfortunately, as institutions and organizations, we tend to make decisions for the community, but we don't make decisions with the community, right? And so that's really, I think, a prime example of how important multidimensional data really is.
Yeah, I think those are great examples. And one thing I can share with people that even a year ago, we didn't know this, but generative AI is really, really good at understanding and analyzing sentiment analysis from focus groups and survey data. So, you have this tool at your disposal now that essentially is free, that you can really dive into correlations between things and sentiment. The benefit of AI is that you don't have to guess whether data is valuable or not, especially in predictive AI, because it will tell you. And so, in the last couple of years, I mean, our process has evolved quite a bit, but any data that represents a person's experience with an organization. All data has value. Some of it has high value and some of it has low value, but it has value. Some of it has a positive correlation. Some of it has a negative correlation. It's still valuable. In higher ed, we've moved so far beyond like gift transactions and things like that. Of course, alumni surveys and focus group data, that type of information, but all the way down to how many degrees do they have? How long did it take to graduate? Did they live on campus? Did they live off campus? Are they a legacy student? Did they, play intramural sports? Did they play an instrument? Which instrument did they play? So, I mean, we literally have clients that have sent that data. How many parking tickets did they have when they graduated? And so all this to say is there's no right or wrong answer, that all data has value, and that with AI, you're never ready, but you're never done. So essentially, you can start small, start with the data that you have, and you have the freedom to always add more data later. But I would really focus the lens on what we consider experiential data. So data that's not inherently biased. All data has bias. Even, by the selection process that Maya was talking about, of like in a university, how did they select students based on scholarship attributions and things like that. But with the data that you have, use data that really represents a person's experience. Like, how well do they know you? Quantify that experience, reduce as much bias data as possible, and continuously monitor that. But it's terribly exciting, to be honest, because universities, colleges, universities, and higher just in general, is a treasure trove of experiences. And if, now, and this wasn't possible 10 years ago, but now with especially machine learning, we can quantify what all those experiences mean to someone who's going to give to you, not just one time, but continue to give to you over a period of time. So I get really excited about that and be able to remeasure a person's connection over time as well.
Unfortunately, we're going to have to start to wrap up here. I appreciate those of you that have hung on a little bit longer. So to wrap up, we've discussed how a holistic approach to data and the responsible and beneficial use of AI can create more inclusive philanthropy. And as you can see, just taking even those small steps today, like reevaluating your data practices, exploring different AI solutions, can really lead to significant impact for your organization down the road. As I mentioned earlier, one of the things we often hear from clients is that implementation is the most challenging step. So as Maya mentioned earlier, and just going to pull up a slide here, we have created a guide on convening focus groups for data collection. This includes sample questions, tips for analyzing the data with different levels of whether it's in-house or outsourced analytics capabilities. And we hope this gives you a leg up on getting started for some of these analyses and trying some different avenues. This guide can be accessed via a QR code that you'll see on your screen. We'll also send this when we send a recording of today's webinar. We will send the guide as well. So if you're not able to access it today, it will be available after this as well. And also, as you can see, there's lots of avenues that we could go down. So stay tuned for more information on an upcoming 2025 micro-credential course, where we'll dive even deeper into these topics and give you some more tactical steps that you can take within your organizations. But until then, thank you so much again to Maya and Nathan for your invaluable insights, and to all of you for participating in this important conversation. I challenge you all to keep challenging yourselves, innovate, lead with inclusivity within your organizations. Together, we really can pave the way for more equity within fundraising and within our fundraising strategies. Have a wonderful day, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.